Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about today is how codependents tend to act in extremes. And it's actually quite amusing once you learn to see it in the codependence. So if you start with the thinking, the codependence thinking process can be quite extreme. Black or white, life or death, all right, all wrong. And you know, it very often shows itself in when you have to make a decision, and specifically a bigger decision in your life. And you can become completely paralyzed by your indecision. Is this the right thing for me to do, or is this the wrong thing? And with that comes expectations that if you do the right thing, you're going to live happily ever after. If you do the wrong thing, something terrible is going to happen, or you're going to feel miserable, or your life is going to fall apart. So there is intense pressure on this decision making in the codependent thinking, that you have to find the right thing. And when we're doing this, you know, trying to figure out what is the right thing or the wrong thing for the future, what it's really talking is our need for controlling the future. Instead of just realizing there are just different experiences, and we can't really ever know which experience will be the best one because we haven't had it yet. The future is always unknown, so the best thing we can do is a guesstimate. Based on the information we have, based on our gut feeling, based on feedback other people might give us, based on our intuition, we can always just do a guesstimate. And sometimes it turns out it's the right place. Sometimes we realize, well, I'm better off somewhere else, but I'm grateful that I had the experience because now I'm more clear. So if you look at it this way, there really are no wrong choices, because there is a gift in every single experience you have. But in this paralysis of decision or indecision, it can show up in the funniest ways. And here's an example from my own life. Back in the days when I was very codependent, I went to the store to buy tea. And for 15 minutes, I was having a pack of tea in each hand, unable to decide which tea I should buy. And if you think about it, it's absolutely absurd, because of course I could just buy both of them. But it didn't occur to me in my extreme codependent thinking. I had to make sure that I got exactly the right tea. And after I've been standing there for 15 minutes, I finally saw the insanity of what I was doing, and I bought both of them. And I have never caught myself in that situation again. But it's a very, very common thing that codependents find themselves in. Is this the right or is this the wrong thing to do? And it can be from small things to big life-changing decisions. Should I go into this education? Should I take this class? Should I be with this person? You know, it could be anything. Should I buy this pair of shoes or that pair of shoes? Should I have this haircut or that haircut? You know, it's very, very funny to watch. And I don't know about you guys, but I had to think about my life would be a disaster if I didn't have the perfect haircut. So again, there was this pressure. I mean, it's just my hair, come on, and it grows out again, so what's a big deal? But really back then, it was a big deal for me to get the right haircut, instead of just trying a haircut. So thankfully, those days are in the past, and what I have learned also is that our need to feel in control of the future is what makes us want to know the answer, or to make us want to decide as soon as possible. And I learned a very important phrase that is called waiting with. Most of us wait for things to happen. But when you can learn to wait with, you enter a relaxed state of trusting that things will become clear to you when the time is right. When the time is right, you will know the answer from inside or outside. But there is this thing of you have to relax and let go of control. That you are not necessarily in control of your life, which you feel you are when you know every single detail of how it will be in the future. So it's important to remember we can't control the future. And the future is always unknown. So there's guidance available for us, and if we learn to wait with and be still in the waiting with, then not the waiting for, but waiting with, which means that you relax in the present moment and are okay with things that are right now, even if you would like things to be improved. Right now is okay. Then there will always be a time when you know the right answer, and this knowing comes from inside yourself. It doesn't come from your mind. So I think I've said before that the codependence is very, very much in the mind. And it's a mind who wants to control. It's a mind who wants to know that it's the right choice or the wrong choice. But the rightness and the wrongness, if you want to call it that, of any choices or any life decisions is something that comes from a deeper place in you, and you can call it your soul or your spirit or your higher self or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't come from the mind. So we can think, and the mind is very helpful in helping us gather information and organize information. But in the end, it's not the mind that will ultimately lead us to our highest good. That will come from somewhere deeper inside of us. So I like to say that the mind is codependent and the heart is not. So you can also think of it as your heart guiding you. If you have the patience and the courage to waiting with for the answer to show itself, the heart will always know what is for your highest good. There's another area in life where the codependent tendency to be an extremist show up. And that's, for example, when it comes to food. In my naturopathic school, the students, when they begin, they have to go on a 3-month health program. And what I have learned over the years and what I have observed over the years, that the students who go into perfectly following the program, they're the ones who perfectly fall back to the worst kind of diet afterwards, if you just look at the health. So they go from one extreme of perfectly healthy food to the other extreme of perfectly unhealthy food. Whereas a more mature, non-codependent way of making life changes is like put one thing in place, let it become a habit and part of your daily life, then add another piece and another piece and another piece. So the people who slowly make the changes, they tend to keep them for longer time without swinging from one extreme to another. I want to, by the way, before I go further, I want to relate another idea of, or another case of this extreme thinking that I experienced, which is actually really, really funny. There was a client that I was working with several years ago, and she was talking about her mother-in-law who was giving her problems. She didn't like her, they didn't get along or whatever. So I asked her, what can you see as a possibility of, how to deal with the situation? What are some of the options you have? And the first thing she says is, I'm going to move to Japan. And of course I thought she was kidding, because that was an extreme choice. There's so many other things she could do. But she was actually very serious. That was the only option she could see for how to deal with her mother-in-law, was to remove herself to the other side of the planet. And this is just another example of how the golden middle way doesn't really exist as an option in the codependent thinking. So what codependents have to learn is also to think, what is a moderate choice? The opposite of extreme is moderation. So healing your codependence, maturing, as codependence is really a condition of psychological immaturity, the codependent thinking, the codependent approach to life is very much that of a child's. So when you heal the codependence, it's almost like you have to grow up. You have to be your own parent and raise yourself in the way you weren't raised. You have to mature into the adult thinking. So the adult thinking is moderate in comparison to the child thinking that tends to be very extreme. Like my son says, he was faced with with having to wait 2 days for something that he really wanted before he could get it. And in his mind it becomes, I have to wait 5 years. So to a child, everything becomes, so extreme, it becomes so big, or it doesn't really exist at all. And you can have so much fun with this when you really start noticing in people. It's really, really fun to watch how they become caught in, should I not? Should I not? And every time you hear the should, it's always an attempt to control, which I'll return to later on. So going back to another way of physically acting in the extreme is that I had a client once, and we were talking about that how the way she dressed was very much, I'll say maybe dysfunctional. She didn't take good care of herself when it came to dresses. It was old clothes. She just kind of grabbed something from the rack, and she didn't really pay any attention to how she looked. And we had talked about that. So she finally goes out and gets herself some new clothes. But in her extreme codependence, she goes and buys herself a beautiful silk ball gown. And, I had to laugh when I saw that, because it's such a typical example of the codependent thinking and the codependent acting. You go from having rags to having ball gowns. Instead of, what is nice clothes for a day-to-day use? And I used to be like that myself. Back in the past, many years ago, in my codependence, I used to have my sister's hand-me-downs, or I had party clothes. But I didn't have some nice clothes for everyday wear. And what I have seen over the years that has changed just with my clothing is that it becomes nice clothes for everyday wear with just a few additions for when I have to paint the house or work in the garden, or when I have to dress up for a party. But this has really become a moderate way of, clothing myself, which is an interesting thing to even look at. And the same thing with the food. It's not about being perfect in your diet. It's the moderation that allows you to excel, to do the best you can every day, but not going into the extreme where it becomes rigidity or fanaticism. Because both rigidity and fanaticism are codependence in another disguise. So moderation. It also comes with the codependence issue of perfectionism. So perfectionism is in the extreme that you have to be perfect in who you are and what you're doing. A more appropriate or functional or healthy way of putting it would be striving for excellence. With the perfectionism, it's about getting approval from the outside. When people recognize how perfect you are, they will finally approve of you, so you can like yourself. Striving for excellence, on the other hand, is like an inner motivation that you desire to do the very best you can, but you're not going to put unrealistic expectations on yourself, and you're not going to put unnecessary pressure on yourself to reach the levels of perfection. So I believe it's like human nature to want to excel at what you're doing, whereas perfectionism is just part of the codependence. So we can nurture ourselves, as I talked about last time, is by Giving ourselves permission to strive for excellence without needing to reach perfectionism. And it's a beautiful way to live when you know that, okay, today I'll do my best to strive for excellence, and it's okay if I'm not perfect. The world is not going to come to an end, people are still going to love me, I'm still going to be comfortable with who I am. But maybe the most important place or area of life where codependents harm themselves the most by being extreme is when it comes to the feelings. Codependence is healed through the feelings with the help of your mind. So you need the mental understanding of the dynamics of codependence to guide you through the emotional healing. So codependents, they tend to suppress feelings. They often have had to because of less than nurturing childhood, as I talked about in the 5 freedoms in an earlier talk. We weren't allowed to feel what we were feeling, so the feelings we weren't allowed to have, we learned to push them down and suppress them. And those are the feelings that feeds our codependence today. So in order to heal our codependence, we need to heal those feelings and learn what is an appropriate adult feeling and what are other kinds of feelings. And I really like the way that Pia Melody describes these kind of feelings. You know, there's 4 kinds of feelings. And the first one is what she calls an appropriate adult feeling. And you can recognize an appropriate adult feeling by always being in proportion to the situation that triggered the feeling or that you have a feeling about. So here's an example from my own life. Several years ago, I reconnected with a friend of mine that I had not been in contact with for several years. We talked together on the phone, and I suggested that we would meet for breakfast. And just for a cup of coffee or something to meet face to face and really reconnect. At that time, she didn't have, the time to actually meet me. She was very busy with her life, so we decided, okay, we'll just give each other a phone call later on. So the next thing I hear is all our common friends are invited to her birthday. And other friends like me that she had just recently reconnected with, they all invited to her birthday, but I'm not. So of course I'm having feelings about this. I'm having feelings of rejection and disappointment. And the first thing I do is, of course, tell myself I shouldn't feel this way. Explaining it away in my mind, that maybe she forgot, or maybe she didn't think about it, or maybe it was just certain people she wanted to invite, maybe it was just people she had been with longer, she had been friends with longer time than she had been friends with me. So I do everything to explain away my feeling, to think it away, to analyze it away, and try very hard not to feel what I'm feeling. And then I catch myself. I go, wait a minute, this is an appropriate adult feeling. It's very appropriate to feel disappointed in this situation. And just by doing that and accepting this feeling, this disappointment, yes, I was disappointed. And it was very appropriate to feel disappointed in this situation. And the disappointment was not a huge disappointment. It was not overwhelming. It was in proportion to the situation. So there was a disappointment, but it was not that big a deal. So I said, okay, I'm disappointed, and so what? The disappointment just faded away. So maybe I should add here that the only thing you ever really need to do with feelings is feel them. Okay? If you feel them by feeling them, they leave your system and you are not acting under an emotional charge any longer. You're back to your true self. So the only thing you have to do with a feeling is to feel it. The fastest way of getting rid of a feeling you don't like is to feel it. Not suppressing it, not analyzing it away. Just feel it and it will go away very soon. So in this instance, I just accepted the disappointment, and it was gone in like 10-15 minutes, and it wasn't a big deal anymore. And to finish up the story, you know, we later connected, and she admitted to me, my friend, that she had intended to invite me, but she just got so caught up in different things that she just never got around to give me the phone call. And she just realized that when the birthday was actually happened, and she noticed that I wasn't showing up to her birthdays, that she had actually forgotten to call me and invite me. So everything was fine. So these are appropriate adult feelings, and they always recognized by being in proportion to the situation you have the feeling about. Now, codependents, they tend to not have emotional boundaries, means that sometimes it can be very difficult for codependent people to know which feelings are theirs and which feelings are not theirs. And it goes back all the way to our early childhood, when very often we had to know what people around us were feeling so that we could adjust ourselves to most likely our parents' emotional state and change our behavior so that we wouldn't create an attack on ourselves or a criticism on ourselves. So, as codependents, we are typically aware of other people's feelings around us. I want to say a very strange things here, because at one time in my codependence recovery, I realized that 90% of the feelings I were feeling, especially all the ones about I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, and all my self-pity, were not actually my own feelings. They were feelings I have taken on from my mother. And I realized that what my parents have used me for was an emotional wastebasket. That all the feelings that they didn't want to have themselves, they have sometimes put into me. It's called carried feelings, taking on the feelings from the people around you. And so I have become the trash can of all the negative feelings that they want to disown. And this was how I pleased my parents, so that I could make sure they would still want to parent me and still approve of me. So it was a huge realization that 90% of my codependence wasn't even mine. And I know this is a very, I almost want to say extreme, but it's a very different way of looking at the codependence and how we have inherited it. That maybe most of your codependence isn't even yours. Whom do it belong to? So part of having emotional boundaries is knowing which are your feelings and which feelings belongs to somebody else. I know from myself in the past that I used to be what I'm thinking of as an emotional chameleon. That whenever I came around other people, I would take on the feelings of whoever else was in the room. And I would get so confused about what was my feelings and what was not my feelings, couldn't understand why I was feeling this way when right before I hadn't been feeling this way. So I had to learn to ask myself, whose feeling am I feeling? Is it really my own feeling, or is it a feeling I have taken on from somebody around me? You could think of it as empathy going overboard. Empathy is being aware of what another person is feeling and feeling with them, but you're not taking it into your own space, you're not internalizing the other person's feelings. So I had a client, she was working as a nurse. And when you're working in a hospital, there's a lot of fear feelings going on and desperation, because it's very sick people, and many of them fear for their lives, and they're dealing with very difficult situations. And also the family members and the relatives of the people who are hospitalized have a lot of feelings too. So this particular client, she had no emotional boundaries. She was wide open to all the feelings around her, which meant that every time she was at work, she was really, really taking on all these feelings from people around her in the hospital. And she was suffering. She was really suffering from it. So we talked about this, and she learned to ask herself, whose feeling am I feeling? And just remembering to ask these questions gave her a distance to the feelings of all the people in the hospital, so she didn't take it on. So sometimes, when we don't understand why am I feeling this way, well, maybe it's not even your own feelings. Maybe it's feeling that belongs to your parent that you have carried with you for a long time. Maybe it's a feeling you picked up from somebody you passed on the street. Maybe it's a feeling you picked up from a friend. You can get it anywhere. So learn to send the feeling back to the owner of the feeling. And here's a very interesting story that one of my clients told me. Her daughter and son-in-law were running a marathon. And they came home after the marathon and they were, full of energy still, which was very interesting. Whereas my client, who usually has a ton of energy, she was getting more and more and more exhausted. And actually so exhausted that she had to go to bed really, really early. I mean, she could hardly move, she was so exhausted. The marathon runners, on the other hand, they went off to party. So we had talked a little bit about this just as a general theory or general dynamic of codependence, the tendency to take on other people's feelings. So she remembered that. So she went into a meditation, and in that meditation she just asked God to send her tiredness back to the rightful owner. As soon as she did that, she started feeling energized herself. Felt much better, got out of bed, was ready to move on with her evening. 2 minutes later, the marathon runners called and says, "Can you come and pick us up? We are so exhausted." And it's very interesting because it really shows to what extent we can take on other people's feelings, even if it's just such a thing as a tiredness. So part of the codependence is really learning what is your stuff and what is not your stuff. Be clear on what belongs to you, what doesn't belong, and what doesn't belong to you, which I will go more into when we talk about boundaries. Returning to the feelings, empathy going overboard, taking on other people's feelings. Learn to recognize, or even just learn to ask yourself, whose feeling am I feeling? Maybe one of the things you will recognize this by is that you will get confused about why you're feeling this way you're feeling, because it doesn't make sense. You don't understand, you can't find the reason for your feeling. So when this happens, ask yourself, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? Whose feeling is this? And then there are the frozen feelings. The frozen feelings are our suppressed feelings from childhood. They're the ones we had to suppress because they were not acceptable. And they're carried feelings from childhood, which is the feelings we take on from the adults around us, the feelings they don't want to own. And a very extreme example of the last kind is, in cases of sexual abuse, adult to child, it's a child that takes on the shame of the offender, the sexual abuser, whereas the one who does the sexual abuse never feels the shame of their own action. So as a sexual abuse victim, you tend to carry the shame that rightfully belongs to the offender. And it's very sad because it's a shame that prevents sexual abuse victims to seek help. But it's not their shame. They have taken it on from the offender. And it's a very drastic example of how we can carry feelings. But it can even be feelings of low self-esteem. Have we taken that on from our adult caregivers? Is it their fears we have internalized and made our own as children? Is it their anger? Is it their sorrow that we have taken in and made our own? And then after having taken it into us, we suppress it. Because as children, we don't know what to do with the feelings that we have taken on from adults around us. So we suppress them, we freeze them. So those are the carried feelings we take on. The frozen feelings are our own feelings that we suppress. In both cases, when these feelings from the past are triggered, you recognize them as an emotional overreaction to the situation. Rule of thumb, if you have an emotional overreaction, it's a feeling from your childhood, whether frozen or carried, that is being triggered. These feelings tend to be bigger in life. You might sometimes feel crazy having these feelings. You might fear for your existence because they tend to take over your reality and you can disappear into those feelings. With these feelings, as with all kinds of feelings, the way to get them out of your system is feel them. They weren't felt in the past, you feel them now, they move out of your system. And with the carried feelings, you can work on returning them to the rightful owner. And sometimes you don't always want to switch, so you try. First try to give it back if it doesn't go away. It might be a frozen feeling, and you will need to just let it wash through you. And this is where all modalities of emotional healing, they work very well, because they deal with the frozen and the carried feelings. And it's really those feelings, the frozen and carried feelings, that keeps our codependence going and alive. So it's so important to coming into healing those feelings. So this is just another example, and I'm talking here that feelings is in extremes, because when codependents suppress a feeling, which we're in such a habit of doing since our early childhood, it becomes not having any feelings at all until the emotional pressure builds out. You have an old feeling being triggered, you have an emotional overreaction. So typical example is people who never get angry at all, and suddenly it's like they have a volcanic eruption of fury and rage. The rest of the time they're just smiling and nice. And it's important to learn also moderation when it comes to your emotional reality. Teach yourself, recognize, notice what are you feeling on an ongoing basis, so that it doesn't accumulate. And learn to recognize whether it's an adult appropriate feeling, empathy gone overboard, or an emotionally overreaction, which just means it's feelings from the past. And when we're dealing with feelings from the past, because they are emotional overreactions, we can't trust the message they are giving us. I have mentioned before that feelings, I believe, are messages to ourselves, from ourselves. But when it's an emotional overreaction, it's out of date. It's a message from something that happens a long time ago. It's not a message about what's happening today. So we have to separate that was then and this is now, the past from the present. Realize which feelings are appropriate for the present and which feelings are appropriate from the past. So both mentally, physically, emotionally, and also all the other areas in life. Here's another example of codependence acting in extremes. It's very typical for codependents who are self-employed that they will go between periods where they don't make any money at all to periods where they suddenly get a lot of money in, which will follow a period of no income, followed by a period of massive income. I used to be there myself. And it's a pattern I see reflected in many codependents who are self-employed. It's like no money, lots of money, no money, lots of money. It's another way of acting in extremes. Another example of that is just left my mind again. Okay, I can't remember it. So these are just some examples of how the codependents are extremist in their thinking, in their emotional reality, and also very often in their behavior. So start looking at your own behavior, your own thinking. For example, when you start beating yourself up negatively, you know, oh, I always do everything wrong, I'm such a loser, I'll never be good enough. That's a very extreme thinking according to the facts of the situation. The other side of the extreme thinking, you know, is when you finally do something right, you switch into self-importance, which is the other extreme, the arrogance. None of them are the moderation of the self-esteem where you know you have equal value to everybody around you. So as you learn to recognize the extremes in yourself, you will have a lot of fun recognizing it in other people and in our society as a whole, which certainly tends to go to extremes.